you for joining me on another episode of VIP Exclusive. I am your host, Fortune, and I have been bringing you a whole lot of VIP content. So, if you've been following us, we've been talking about a series of Afrobeats. We've been talking about how the journey of Afrobeats started from the 1970s. We had Fela and Nicola Pokuti with a whole lot of people that came together to bring about Afrobeats in Nigeria and in the whole of Africa as a whole. So, today we're going to be talking about the history of Afrobeats. We'll be taking it down from the 1970s down to the 1990s and then to the 2000s, and going on and going forth like that down till date. But we'll know how we'll spread it across episodes. Well, anyway, so let's talk about how music started in the 1970s with Fela and Nicola Pokuti. We know how he came together with his drummer Tony Allen, and then they put together this beautiful sound, which was like a mixture of different genres. And then sadly, Fela and Nicola Pokuti died in 1997. He died of AIDS and AIDS complication, and that was really sad. But before that, he was arrested for his use of cannabis. Fela had a whole lot of scrutiny going on in his life, considering that he was a political activist and then he was a public figure. So, once you're out there, people just take pleasure in scrutinizing your life and making sure that they find any little fault and all of that. But let's not get into that. So we know generally in the 90s, it was a collective era and it was filled with a whole lot of growth. We saw the rise of digital music, we saw the proliferation of reggae music, and we also saw the birth of Nigerian hip-hop music. That era was filled with so lot of stars, like a whole lot of stars. We had Dizzy K, we had Junior and Pretty, we had Raski Mono, we had Christy Essien Ibokwe, we had Charlie Boy, Daniel Wilson, Alexito, Blackie, and so many artists in that. In fact, that year was packed with a whole lot of stars. But none of these stars were as successful as Magic Fashek. That his career went over the skies when he went to America, and then he became so popular. That was a really, really good decision for him. For me, I would say that going to America was a really good decision for that artist. So the 90s was mostly actually a quiet era, given that there was coup d'etat, and then artists had to, do what we talk about, the nightlife. What the nightlife will speak of as underground music. I know these artists couldn't go out there and do as much as they wanted to. We had artists like Lagbaja who performed in the Night Shift Coliseum in Ikeja, and then music was just really, really quiet then until the death of Abacha. May his soul rest in peace. Abacha's death didn't just bring about democracy, it also brought about, an era for the music industry to actually flourish. It was like daylight. It just brought like lights to the industry, and then artists could do their thing and then go out there and perform freely. We had whole lot of young and enthusiastic Nigerian artists in that time. In fact, that time was like really, really packed. Most of these artists were actually coming together to form collectives and form boy bands, and then we had whole lots of nice boy bands that time. If you were born in that year, I would say that you actually had a taste of good music. We had artists like Plantation Boys, we had Tribesmen, we had 419 Squad, we had Twinax. In fact, it was packed with so many artists. And not to forget, there were also solo acts in that time that were banging. I use the word banging because we have to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. We had artists like Sonny Okosun, Tony Tetila. I like to say that these artists are actually they are forever in the limelight. They've been going on from the 90s, and if you listen to some of these songs till now, you're still going to enjoy the rhythm, the sound, and the lyrics. We had artists like Sheena Peters, Oliver the Coke, Savita Olaya. In fact, I can't even get to all of it because I'm very sure that all these artists were really doing good. Not to forget, we also had female artists that were banging in that era. Women, we always have a way of bringing the spice to everything. We had Onyeka Onwenu, we had Martha Oletu, we had Ubi Onyowa. In fact, 90s was packed with a whole lot of goodness. So now to go into the early 2000s, the early 2000s was more like a transition, given that in the 90s they experienced coup d'etat and then went out of coup d'etat. But when we entered the 2000s, then these artists were now allowed to express themselves to like the biggest, to like bigger folds, and then they could reach out to more people. And then we had like people coming together to become boy bands, and then some splitting out of their bands. That era actually gave room for artists to feel like they could actually go on their own and do something out there. An example of one of those albums is Plantation Boys. The artists in that crew, or should I say boy band, were Two-Face, we had Blackface, and then we had Face. And they had like a whole country of faces. Anyway, so Two-Face was one of the artists that broke out of boy bands and came out, and they became a thing on his own. He released this album Face to Face, which was a really good album, and he also released it under Kenny's Music, which was the record label of Plantation Boys, and then he still released his album under that record label. Well, that's a really good thing. But it's not all the artists that split it at that point. We had boy bands like P Square, as Peter and Paul, which are still banging to date. The band, Timaya, we had Nice, we had Don Jazzy, and all these artists, I must say, this, in fact, I can say that the 2000s, gave birth to the present day music, because most of those artists that were singing at that time are still in the limelight till now. It's just that most of them are now having their own record labels, and they're now inviting more people into the industry. We have a whole lot of youngins now, but let's not fly into the future. We're still in the 2000s. So going down to 2005 to 2010, Afrobeats, really gained momentum in that time. Okay, from the 2005 to 2010 era in the music industry, we know that era was more like a structured era for the music industry. We had artists that were able to put out their music in the digital space. We had less CDs being put out there. We had less DVDs. And then it's not like the CDs and DVDs were completely eradicated. No, they were still there, but the digital music was more focused and then it was more structured. We had record labels that were more structured than the previous ones. We had record labels like EME that was founded by Banky W in 2008. We have Chocolate City that was founded by Audu Mekori. We also have Mo Hits that was founded by D'banj and Don Jazzy, which was established in 2004. All these record labels were like a rebirth for the music industry because they were more structured and artists were given a better platform to put out their music to the national space. And that was more like a birth of the Nigerian music evolving from being just basic and sticking to just CDs to be out there in the digital space, and then we can actually upload our music on platforms and all of that. And then some of these artists that were signed at that time were given more opportunity, and then they were given a better platform to put out their music. We had MI, who was signed to Chocolate City. We had Wizkid, who was signed to EME. We also have Mohis, who signed Dr. Seed, The Prince, Wanda Cole, and so many other artists. Some artists, we have Skills, we have K-Switch. In fact, there are a whole lot of artists that were signed in that time. I think more artists were being signed at that period than earlier because, those earlier record labels did not have the platform, they didn't have the funding and all these things. There were a whole lot of factors that restricted them from signing so many artists. But 2005 2010 was more like a space for these artists to be given an opportunity to put out their music out there. So 2005 until 2010 was a good time for the music industry. So in 2011, that's after that era we just spoke about, we have Olamide, which is one of the Bevy artists at that time. Olamide, aka Bado Snare, and all the many things that they add to their names. At this time, he was making a whole lot of waves in the industry. He had record-breaking singles. He had debut studio albums. You know, at this time, digital music was like a thing at this time. So there was no setback for him. The guy was just flying all into the waves and all of that. And he was signed into Coded Tunes, which was owned by ID Kabasa. At that time, he also hosted a whole lot of artists. We had Nice and so many more artists at that time. You know, that was more like a space for Yoruba hip-hop music. You know, Olamide came with this whole Yoruba rap. Anyway, not to get into that for too long, we're going to talk about the 2011 to date in our next episode. Let's just cut it for today. You know, let's come to an end. Let's call it a day. I know you guys are sad because you want to hear more of this, but we're going to talk about it in the next episode, as I said earlier. Thank you so much for joining me. I am your host, Fortune. Thank you for joining us on VIP Exclusive. Don't forget to follow us on all our social media platforms. We have Instagram at EVIP Magazine, Twitter, EVIP Magazine, Facebook, EVIP Magazine, and also YouTube on EVIP Magazine. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.